Alright, thank you if you've come across this video and you take time to watch it. I pray that it'll help you. I do a weekend thought and I record it and put it on YouTube so someone else can come across it, so I can reach more people, and hopefully it'll be a help and encouragement to you. If you haven't subscribed to my channel on YouTube, a look at the Bible through the eyes of a sinner, or it's on Facebook. You can like my page, a look at the Bible through the eyes of a sinner, where I post my weekend thoughts where people can read it. And I'm not doing this to be seen. I'm doing this to spread the gospel, to show that I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And this weekend thoughts on pride, and I call this a Nebuchadnezzar Christian. Daniel chapter 4 verse 11 and verse 14 says, "The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. He cried aloud and said, Thus hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches." Okay, those are the two verses. Now, what I'm doing is I've typed up my weekend thought and I post it, but then I read it to keep my videos kind of short, because I did one on the Holy Ghost and it ended up being like a 45-minute video with two 20 minutes and one 5-minute. So I want to keep it simple to where it's not that long and you can just understand it. So we see Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Okay, this is the king of Babylon had a disturbing dream and was trying to find someone to interpret the dream to him. The wise men and the enchanters, no one could interpret it. But then Daniel came and told him the meaning of his dream in verses 19 up through 27 of this chapter. And Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that basically he was the tree and he was going to be cut down. And then in verses 28 through 37 of this chapter, the dream comes to pass and the vision is fulfilled. With seeing Nebuchadnezzar, I realize that we have a lot of Nebuchadnezzar Christians. I mean, yes, we know that pride comes before destruction, but even though pride's a dangerous thing, I believe it's even more dangerous when we have a prideful Christian than it is to have a prideful lost soul. Us as prideful Christians get so high in our walk of faith and we forget where we come from. We get so proud of our accomplishments, not only with the accomplishments of this life, but our accomplishments in our walk of faith. Our positions and our titles that we hold in church, that we forget that it was God who brought us up and it wasn't by our own might. So how do we become a Nebuchadnezzar Christian? Deuteronomy 8 verse 11 through 14 says, "Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments, and his judgments, and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses to dwell therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, and from the house of bondage." From reading Deuteronomy, seeing how we become as Nebuchadnezzar, as we forget what God has done for us, and we become comfortable and think all of our accomplishments is from our own works, and not the grace of God. Once we become like Nebuchadnezzar, then we break our fellowship with God. We don't lose our salvation, but we damage our relationship with Christ. Psalms 138:6 says, "Though the Lord be high, yet he hath respect unto the lowly, but the proud he knoweth afar off." Proverbs 8:13 says, "The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogancy, and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate." Proverbs 16:5 says, "Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished." From reading the verses where it says, "The proud the Lord knoweth far off." So obviously when we are prideful, we withdraw ourselves from the presence of the Lord and break our fellowship with him. God tells us in Proverbs 8 verse 13 to hate pride and arrogancy. If God wants us to hate it, then obviously he hates it. Then in Proverbs 16:5 said, "A proud heart is an abomination to God." It's just as bad as homosexuality according to Leviticus 18 verse 22. They both are an abomination to God. After we've broken our fellowship with God from being prideful, then we begin to act like the devil. Isaiah 14 verse 12 through 16 says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" Then it goes on to say, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. See, even Satan himself fell because of pride. He got jealous of God and wanted to be exalted like him. He wanted to be at the top, and of course, as you can see, his pride didn't get him too far. Now that we are acting like the devil, we are deceiving ourselves. Odebai, verse 3 and 4, says, The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, Who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as an eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. Galatians 6:3 says, For if a man thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. 2 Timothy 3 verse 4 says, People are traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Proverbs 27:2 says, Let another man praise thee, not thine own mouth, a stranger, and not thine own lips. From reading these verses, we see that if we get so high-minded, God will bring us down. We're nothing without God. We end up loving our pleasures and feeling accomplished of what we did rather than being lovers of God and what He did. Then not to praise ourselves. If we are praised, let others praise us instead of saying, Hey, look what I did. Did you see what I accomplished? But the most dramatic and hurtful thing that happens when we're prideful is we hinder the world from turning to the truth. Matthew 5 verse 13 tells us that we're the salt of the earth. We're supposed to give the world a good taste of Christ. But we've become too salty because of pride. We've clogged the arteries of the lost. We've made Christ too salty that the lost can't stomach the taste of Christ. Matthew 5 verse 16 says we're the light of the world. The world is a dark place. People don't know where they're going, so we are supposed to be a light to lead the lost to the cross. But our lights are so bright because of pride that we blind the world to where they can't even get onto the path to find the cross. Matthew 5 verse 20 says, If our righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, we shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes we get too righteous because of our pride. We walk by church and not by faith. We act, dress, look, and carry ourselves a better than you kind of way. A lot of Christians today are yesterday's scribes and Pharisees. We are holier than thou, and just because people don't look, act, dress a certain way, then they aren't allowed to enter into the doors of the church. Matthew 7 verse 5 says, Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. We get too judgmental because of pride. We get into our standards that this isn't right and that isn't right, and because others don't see the things the way you see them, then they are doomed for hell. They didn't get the same Jesus as you got. Now that we know what happens to us when we get prideful, we must know where pride comes from. 1 John chapter 2 verse 16 says, For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. Pride comes from the world. We must stop in our tracks sometimes and just think. Romans 12:3 says, For I say, though the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. We all have different purposes, but we all have the same God. We all have the same faith. So we may have been the before Nebuchadnezzar Christian, but we really need to strive to be the Nebuchadnezzar after he was brought down low and stay humble. Daniel chapter 4 verse 34 and 35 says, And at the end of days I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes into heaven, and my understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What dost thou? You see, after Nebuchadnezzar got brought down low, he realized that God is everything and he is nothing. The world is nothing compared to God, but God is everything. The most precious, amazing thing that our minds can't even get a grasp or comprehend is nothing compared to God. We always need to have that mindset and keep God on top and realize that we're nothing without God's grace. Because even now and in the end, if you look at Isaiah 2 verse 17 says, the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of man shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. So we may be prideful in this life and have our moments, but we need to humble ourselves, because all the time and everything, God gets the glory. Even when it's the Lord's day, according to Isaiah 2:17, everyone and everything will be brought down low, and only the Lord shall be exalted. So which kind of Nebuchadnezzar Christian are you? The before or the after?